What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a broken compass? And every person in that room laughed. Hold on to that question. Because what happened to Phoebe Callahan started exactly that way, and where it ended will stay with you for a long time. When the real estate patriarch died, his second wife walked away from the will reading with the Vancouver waterfront properties, the Calgary office towers, and a development empire worth close to $3 billion. His estranged daughter, the one who hadn't spoken to him in 11 years, received a cracked antique brass compass, tarnished and cold, with a broken needle that hadn't pointed north since the 1980s. The room didn't even bother to hide its amusement. But that compass wasn't broken. It was the most precisely engineered thing Reginald Callahan ever built. Phoebe Callahan, 36 years old, taught grade 4 at a public school in Sudbury, Ontario. She drove a 12-year-old Subaru that burned oil, owed $63,000 in consolidated student debt, and had been surviving on supply teacher contracts for 2 years after budget cuts wiped out her full-time position. She didn't come to Vancouver expecting money. She came because when a man who once called himself your father dies at 68 of heart failure, you buy the red-eye ticket even if you can barely afford it, even if the last real conversation you had ended with you slamming a phone down in a Whistler Airbnb bathroom and crying for 4 hours. She came for closure, maybe for an apology, for something that resembled acknowledgement. What she got was a boardroom full of people who looked through her like she was a smudge on the glass. The law offices of Harrison, Leach and Marsh occupied the 31st floor of a tower on West Georgia Street in downtown Vancouver, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Burrard Inlet on a grey November afternoon. Phoebe arrived 12 minutes early in her good blazer, the charcoal one she wore for parent-teacher evenings, and was shown to a seat at the far end of a glass conference table, long enough to land a small aircraft on. She was given water. No one spoke to her. Reginald Callahan's second wife, Lucinda Vance Callahan, swept in at 2 minutes past the hour in a camel wrap coat and dark sunglasses she didn't remove until she sat down, which Phoebe recognized as a studied choice. Lucinda was 51, a former property developer in her own right before she married Reginald 14 years ago, and she wore money the way some people wear perfume. Pervasively, intentionally, so you couldn't ignore it. Behind her came Miles Callahan, 31, Lucinda's son from her first marriage, whom Reginald had formally adopted 11 years ago, and who now ran operations at Callahan Development Corporation. Miles had the particular quality of a man who has never once in his life considered whether he belongs in a room. He glanced at Phoebe with the brief attention you give a piece of furniture you didn't order. Tobias Marsh, the senior partner and Reginald's personal solicitor for 22 years, sat at the head of the table. He was in his late 60s, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of measured stillness that only decades of courtroom work produces. He opened a folder, cleared his throat once, and began. The estate was staggering. To Lucinda, Reginald left the Vancouver waterfront portfolio, 4 properties collectively assessed at $420 million, along with the family home in West Vancouver, the lake house near Kelowna, and a controlling 55% stake in Callahan Development Corporation. Miles received the Calgary Commercial Real Estate Holdings, a $30 million investment account, and full operational authority over the Alberta division. Trusts, brokerage accounts, an art collection curated over 30 years. The numbers moved through the room like weather. Phoebe sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the water glass in front of her. She had told herself, on the plane, that she felt nothing about any of it. She had almost convinced herself this was true. "And to my daughter," Tobias said, and something in the room went very still. "Phoebe Elaine Callahan, I leave the brass compass belonging to my father, Chester Callahan. May she always find her way." Tobias reached into a wooden box beside his folder and placed it in front of her. A pocket compass, old and tarnished green around the seams, the cover engraved with 3 mountain peaks and a small sun above them, the letters CC worn nearly smooth beneath. Behind the cracked glass, the needle sat completely dead. Miles made a sound, not quite a laugh, something that communicated contempt so complete it didn't need a punchline. Lucinda leaned forward and arranged her expression into something resembling sympathy. "It's a family heirloom, Phoebe. Reggie always said you were the sentimental one." She let the word sentimental do what she needed it to do, and then sat back and adjusted her bracelet. Phoebe picked up the compass. It was heavier than it had any right to be. The brass was cold, and the mountain engraving pressed into her palm. She had never met Chester Callahan. He died 6 years before she was born. She stood up without a word, put the compass in her blazer pocket, and walked out of the boardroom. She made it past the reception desk with its white orchid arrangement before her legs simply refused to continue in a purposeful direction, and she sat down on a low leather bench against the wall and pressed her hands together between her knees. 11 years of silence. 11 years of unreturned phone calls and birthday messages that went unacknowledged, and the slow process of learning to stop hoping. And this was what it amounted to, a dead compass and a room full of barely suppressed laughter. She heard footsteps. Miss Callahan. Tobias Marsh appeared around the corner, moving quickly, his briefcase already in hand. He was checking the hallway behind him with a careful, deliberate attention that made Phoebe straighten despite herself. "I need you to come with me, please. The stairs." "The reading is over, Mr. Marsh." "The reading is concluded," he said quietly. "But there are things your father needed me to tell you that could not be said in that room. He had good reason to believe Lucinda had compromised one of my junior partners. He was also certain the conference room had been swept for devices after she spent 40 minutes alone in it the week before his death." He met her eyes. "Please, the stairs." She followed him. They took the fire exit down 3 flights to the parkade, where a grey Lexus sat idling. Tobias gestured for her to get in. She did, because something in the quality of his voice, the way he had paused before her name during the reading, the weight of the compass in her pocket, something told her that whatever came next was the actual story. They pulled onto Georgia Street and headed north over the Lions Gate Bridge, and Tobias talked. He told her that Reginald Callahan had spent the final 3 years of his life building a case in the dark. 18 months before his death, he discovered that Lucinda and Miles had been systematically forging his signature on property transfer documents, quietly redirecting equity through numbered companies registered in Delaware and the Caymans. They had already moved close to $400 million offshore. A private forensic accounting firm, not his regular accountants, who he no longer trusted, had confirmed it. What was worse, Miles had been quietly rewriting the terms of the Development Corporation's construction loans, personally guaranteeing them against assets he and Lucinda had already transferred away. They were building a house of debt using walls that weren't theirs anymore. "Why didn't he go to the RCMP?" Phoebe said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "He intended to, but by the time the forensic work was complete, his cardiologist had told him his heart was failing. Months, not years, he knew that any public legal action would trigger an immediate response. Injunctions, asset freezes, years of litigation he wouldn't live to see resolved. Tobias kept his eyes on the highway. So he chose to work differently, quietly, in the only direction they weren't watching. "The compass," Phoebe said. He glanced at her. He said if you left it on the table, the conversation was over. If you took it, you were ready. A pause. Press the mountain, the center peak. She pulled the compass out, turned it over in her hands. The 3-peak crest, the worn CC beneath. She pressed her thumb to the tallest peak. A click, small as a key turning in a lock. The back panel separated, shifted sideways on a hidden seam that should not have been possible to machine in something this old. Behind it, set in foam, were 2 items. A micro SD card no larger than a fingernail and a steel key with a 3-peak stamp on the bow. The same mountains. Phoebe sat very still and looked at them for a long time. They drove north through Horseshoe Bay and up into the dry interior, where the temperature dropped and the trees changed and the sky widened out around the mountains in a way that always made Phoebe feel small and clear-headed simultaneously. Tobias explained the rest. For 15 years, Reginald had been acquiring wilderness land in the Caribou Mountains through a company called North Star Properties, Inc., registered in Tobias's name as blind trustee, formally transferred to Phoebe that morning. The property didn't appear in any disclosure he had made to Lucinda, to Miles, or to the corporation's board. It existed in no document they could access, and 4 years ago a geological survey commissioned by North Star had identified significant mineral deposits beneath the acreage, copper, gold, and molybdenum, conservatively valued at over $1 billion by 2 independent assessors. "There's more," Tobias said. "Over the past 14 months, your father structured close to $800 million in development financing from North Star to Callahan Development Corporation. Callable loans. Lucinda and Miles signed the personal guarantees 4 months ago. They believed they were borrowing from a private equity firm in Toronto. They didn't know the firm was yours. They turned off the highway onto gravel, then onto a logging road that Tobias navigated by memory. 40 minutes into the trees, the road curved and the headlights. It was dusk now. The sky at the mountain line, the color of embers, hit something tall and dark ahead. Wrought iron gates set between stone pillars, wrapped in dead ivy, with a brass nameplate on the left pillar that read, "The Summit, Est, 1952. Phoebe stepped out. The mountain air hit her like cold water, clean and sharp, smelling of pine resin and distance. She walked to the pillar and slid the steel key into a flat metal reader mounted in the stone. A pause. Then, from deep within the pillar, the low grind of heavy gears, the sound of something old and deliberate awakening. The gates swung inward. What the headlights revealed was not a cabin. It was a timber frame lodge built into the mountain slope, sprawling and copper-roofed and flanked by century-old spruce, flooding the circular gravel drive in warm light. Behind it, the mountain rose, against the last dark red of the sky. The grounds were meticulously maintained. Someone had been caring for this place. For years, somebody paid, and nobody asking questions. Inside, exposed timber beams, a carved stone fireplace, a wall of east-facing windows designed to catch the morning light on the peaks. Tobias led her down a corridor behind a paneled wall that swung open at a concealed trim latch, and then they descended a staircase into a room carved from the bedrock itself. Concrete walls, LED strip lighting, a climate-controlled anteroom before a heavy steel door. Phoebe slid the micro-SD card into the terminal beside the vault. A decryption sequence loaded and resolved to black. A video file began. Reginald Callahan looked smaller on screen than she remembered him. He was sitting in a leather chair, the one by the east window, she would later realize, wearing a heavy flannel shirt, his shoulders rounded with age and illness. But his eyes were the same exact shade of blue she had spent 11 years trying to stop missing. Sharp, steady, looking directly at the camera, as though he could see her through it, across whatever distance time had put between them. Phoebe. His voice was rougher than she remembered. "If you're watching this, you took the compass, Constance. I hoped you would. You always kept the things other people thought weren't worth keeping." He paused. "I am so sorry for what happened in that room today, and I am more sorry than I know how to properly say for the 11 years before it. Let me explain. Not to excuse myself, but because you deserve to understand what I did and why." She did not move. "After your mother died, Lucinda made it clear to me that if I maintained any visible relationship with you, financially, emotionally, anything they could see, you would become a target. Not directly. But through her lawyers, her contacts, her ability to introduce problems into your life, you weren't equipped to fight at 25 years old with student loans and no safety net. I didn't trust myself to protect you in the open, so I made the hardest decision I have ever made." His voice thinned at the edges but didn't break. "I pulled away. I told myself it was temporary. Then months became years and years became something I no longer knew how to undo. That is not a strategy. That is cowardice dressed up as strategy. I should have found another way. I'm sorry I didn't." Phoebe pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "What they've inherited is a trap," her father continued, and something shifted in his face. Something almost satisfied. Callahan Development Corp. has callable debt it cannot service against assets it no longer actually owns, because those assets were transferred to North Star 18 months ago through sale agreements that their lawyers never examined because they didn't know to look for them. Tobias has the complete forensic record of what they did to me and what I did in return. Everything in that vault is yours." The vault door clicked and swung open. Phoebe turned. The room was the size of a generous office, shelved floor to ceiling. Share certificates in fireproof sleeves, labeled document boxes in her father's handwriting, hard drives in a sealed, climate-controlled cabinet, dated and tagged, legal files thick as textbooks. And on the center shelf, in a simple frame without embellishment, a photograph she had never seen. Phoebe at approximately 8 years old, standing on a dock somewhere in bright summer light, laughing at something out of frame, squinting against the sun, completely unself-conscious. She had no memory of the photograph being taken. She had not known he kept it. "Use this well," her father's voice said from the screen behind her. "Protect the people who work for that company. There are 412 of them, and not one of them did anything wrong. Then, Phoebe, fix something. You've spent your whole career in classrooms the system underfunds, teaching children with supplies you bought yourself. You know what shortage looks like from the inside. Fix some of it." A long breath. "Then, I love you. I should have said it every year. I'm saying it now." The screen went dark. Phoebe stood in the vaulted room beneath the Caribou Mountains, surrounded by the evidence of a decade and a half of quiet, meticulous love expressed entirely in the wrong language, and she let herself cry. Not the controlled, furious tears she'd held back in the boardroom hallway, but something deeper and older, the kind that has nothing to do with the present moment, and everything to do with all the moments that built up to it. The years of waiting for a call that didn't come. The voicemail she had left and never mentioned again. The way she had learned to stop expecting things so she could stop being disappointed, and how that had felt like strength and was really a kind of loss. She cried for a long time. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her good blazer, picked up the framed photograph from the shelf, and carried it upstairs. 7 weeks later, the executive floor of Callahan Development Corporation's Cole Harbor Tower had a different quality to it than it had at the will reading. The kind of quality that spreads through an organization when something fundamental is wrong, and everyone can feel it, but no one will say it aloud. The kind of quality produced by a company that is beginning to understand it has been building on sand. Lucinda arrived for the emergency board session in her usual armor, the silk blouse, the perfect posture, the composure of a woman who has always understood that confidence projected in a crisis is its own form of currency. Miles was behind her, jaw tight, working his phone with the focused aggression of someone reading financial news he does not want to read. The message had come that morning from their corporate bank. North Star Properties, Inc. had formally accelerated all outstanding development financing effective at midnight. Total callable balance, $817 million. Personal guarantee provisions were under review. A representative from North Star's legal team would be attending the board meeting. The boardroom doors opened. Tobias Marsh came in first, then Phoebe. She was wearing a dark grey suit, not bespoke, but well cut, the kind purchased by a woman who had very recently discovered she could afford it and had not yet entirely adjusted to the fact. Her posture was the posture of someone who has spent a decade managing rooms of 9-year-olds during standardized testing week and knows exactly how to hold space when it is contested. She walked to the head of the table without hesitation, set down a leather folio, and looked at Lucinda. Lucinda looked back. Something moved behind her eyes, a rapid, involuntary recalculation. "Who authorized your presence in this building?" Miles said. The building's owner, Phoebe said. North Star Properties completed acquisition of the tower's underlying land title this morning. You'll receive formal notification from the land titles office by end of day. The room went completely quiet. Whatever your father told you, whatever documents you've been given, Lucinda began. We've already filed, Phoebe said, with the RCMP Commercial Crime Section in Vancouver and the BC Securities Commission. The forensic accounting records document 3 years of fraudulent instrument transfers and offshore diversion of corporate assets. The commission executed a production order on the Cayman accounts at 6 this morning. She let a beat pass. Tobias filed evidence preservation notices across all related institutions on Monday. Miles stood up fast enough that his chair hit the wall behind him. His face had gone a color that had nothing to do with the room's lighting. You can't. The personal guarantees you signed in August are fully enforceable against your remaining individual assets, Phoebe said. Whatever hasn't already been frozen will be subject to assessment and seizure within the North Star foreclosure proceedings. You'll want to retain criminal defense counsel before you retain civil counsel, and you'll want to do it this week. Lucinda's composure didn't shatter. It fractured slowly along a seam that must have been building for weeks, since the first loan maturity notices arrived, since the offshore accounts stopped responding, since the word North Star started appearing in documents that shouldn't have mentioned it. She set her hands flat on the table. When she spoke, her voice was quiet in a way it had never been in the boardroom before. Reginald would never have. Reginald did, Phoebe said simply. He just made certain you were looking in the wrong direction the entire time. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and placed the brass compass on the mahogany table. The tarnished case, the 3-peak crest, the cracked glass over the dead needle. She set it down gently, directly in front of Lucinda's hands. That's yours, Phoebe said. I don't need it anymore. She picked up her folio, nodded to Tobias, and walked out. In the elevator descending from the 14th floor, she looked at her reflection in the polished steel door and thought about her grade 4 classroom in Sudbury. The reading corner she had built herself with a second-hand bookshelves, the rug from the garage sale, the parent-teacher evenings where she stretched department budgets that hadn't been increased in 4 years. She thought about 412 people who had worked for a company being run by people who had never once thought about what it would mean when it fell. She thought about what her father had said. You know what shortage looks like from the inside. She had a lot of work to do. She stepped out of the elevator into the Cole Harbour lobby, pushed through the glass door, and walked out into the November cold with the inlet grey and wide in front of her, and the mountains rising north, white at their peaks now, and steady. If Phoebe's story moved you, if you've ever been written off by someone who should have known better, or if you've ever held on to something small that turned out to be everything, hit like right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about the moments when everything turns. And before you go, what would you have done with that compass? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one.